Finally, we're going to talk again about these compact delivery systems. Next slide. As promised, explanation of what levitation is. It's an air gap in the weapon that allows the implosion to work a whole lot better. And this is illustrated in this Iranian nuclear weapons design from circa 2003. It was presented in 2018 by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu as part of the Iranian nuclear weapon archive. And the white in the diagram there, that's the airspace. Now, assuming it's the scale, and it may not be, the lavender thing is the HEU core, which by my calculations would be about 5 inches in diameter. So that would mean that the airspace is something like, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches. It was fairly sizable. Now, the US nuclear weapons designer, Ted Taylor, in the classic book, The Curve of Binding Energy, explained levitation, though back then he couldn't use the term. He didn't use the term because that was too hush-hush back in 1974. But using this description of how you hammer a nail, it provides a very intuitive way why levitation is very useful in producing a nuclear weapon. Next slide. Now, the Fat Man design was big. It was 5 feet in diameter, and you can tell by this guy standing next to it in the doorway. It weighs 5 tons. You can kind of tell by the automotive tires they had to put on that trolley. As I say, it wasn't levitated. One of the reasons it was so big and heavy, you needed a B-29 to deliver it. And one of the striking things is that many people still assume the nation's first weapons are always going to look like Fat Man. This came up with North Korea after they tested. There was this, oh yeah, well, they can test, but can they put it on a missile? Can they make one that's small enough to put on a missile? And as we'll see, yes. Next slide. Now, supporting sort of the Fat Man idea is that both the USSR and the UK's first weapons were also big and heavy. Now, the USSR was well aware of the advantages of levitation. In fact, they came up with a design that was only about half the weight of Fat Man. But then in the charming era that was Stalin, and for some reason there are people in Russia who are nostalgic for those days, the Russian or Soviet intelligence provided the specifics of the US Fat Man design. And so that's the ones that the USSR used, not because they thought it was better, but because in the good old Stalin days, if you proposed something that was different to that and it didn't work out, well, then you would be treated as a saboteur and dealt with accordingly. So therefore, it was a lot easier to just say, okay, this is what the Intel guys said. And indeed, if it went wrong, you could say, well, it was the Intel guys' fault. The UK, Penny, as I said, was at Los Alamos. He knew the specifics of the Fat Man design very well. But as they were building it, the Fat Man design was pretty close to critical, and Penny grew uneasy about that. So he introduced some levitation into the weapon to address the criticality designs, the concerns. It was still a large, heavy weapon. The diagram there is of the first
Greg,
British. Yes?
Can you go back to your design and explain why going to levitation or hollow core would ameliorate the criticality problem? And that may be worth actually explaining.
Well, because you'd have the tamper away from the core, 3 or 4 inches. The tamper would be thinner because if you took that mass that was right next to the core and you expanded it out, it becomes thinner. So that tends to help with the criticality issues. So this weapon shown is the first British weapon, the Blue Danube design. You can see it is still a very large design, though the British at least had a better sense of how to design a ballistic case for their weapon. The Fat Man didn't seem to. Next slide. Now, 60 years ago, both the French and the Chinese appreciated the advantages of levitation quite from the start. The first French device was only about the third of the weight of the Fat Man, still produced 3.5 times the yield. The first Chinese devices were again similar size, but since they used HEU, not quite as much yield, but still a lot. The Chinese design is the one on the right there in the picture shown by that Chinese woman there. You get some idea that it's a good deal smaller, but probably still not something you couldn't put on the sort of ballistic missiles that people are interested in today. Next slide. Now, for a true tactical delivery, it's still easy, especially using levitation, to come up with a simple fission device that you can tactically deliver. The US came up with a design called the Mark 7. It was in service for many years. It was very versatile: gravity bomb, ballistic missile warhead, depth charge, air-to-surface missile, though not the sort that you might imagine. As shown in the picture is the air-to-surface one. They just stuck a little rocket on the back, and there's a test of course, a dummy weapon. The Navy wanted to use it to loft at warships. It would go like 6 or 7 miles at the warship. The Mark 7 was substantially lighter and smaller, only half the diameter, a sixth of the weight of Fat Man, still produced substantially more yield. It was a very popular design. Next slide. And the Mark 7 isn't anywhere near the limit of this. The French produced a simple fission device, the AN-52, a gravity bomb. It was in service for a couple decades. It was also ballistic missile warhead on their Pluton tactical ballistic missile. It's only 2 feet in diameter, a tenth the weight of Fat Man, still more yield. And in the photograph, it's that thing in the middle there, that small thing on the center line. There's 2 big things on the wings of this Mirage are fuel tanks. Next slide. And see the outcome of this again from the 2018 Netanyahu presentation. Again, this now nearly 20-year-old Iranian nuclear weapon design. They're not starting with Fat Man, they're starting with the AN-52. It's only 2 feet in diameter. It's being carried on a Shahab 3, so the weight's probably similar as well. And they have 1,000-kilometer range, and now Iran has, of course, better ballistic missiles who probably take it even further. Next slide. Conclusions. You can see from the World War II US experience that instead of 6 months, it's really only a week or 2 to produce the metal components from the weapon, from things like UF6 or plutonium nitrate. The non-nuclear components can be produced in parallel and take less than a year. Now, this is important even now because people are saying, well, yeah, Iran's going to have all this material, but it's going to take them years, 2, 3 years. Even the Israelis are saying this before they can produce a nuclear weapon. I doubt it. And instead of countries starting with Fat Man, it's far more likely they're going to be using AN-52 as their first starter weapon. And with that, I'll conclude.